I'm Paul Hanson. I'm going to moderate this panel on ecology and generative AI. I'm from the University of Wisconsin. We'll go into a little bit more in-depth introductions in a minute, but I do want to welcome the rest of the panel members here. Chris Florian from NEON, Zach McEachran from University of Minnesota, Jordan Reed from CUAHSI, and Mike SanClements from Battelle NEON as well. We went or we had lunch together, and it didn't take us very long through our discussions to figure out we are more of a basket of problems than we are solutions. So we, in keeping with your inspiration, Vipin, we're going to have a lot of questions, probably a lot more questions than solutions, but we're looking forward to having some fun here. So the way this is going to work, we're going to go through a set of introductions where we each have, maybe a few minutes, up to 5 minutes to talk about our backgrounds and say a few things about the context here. And then I'm going to provide a slide, which is sort of a conceptual construct for ecology so that we can take this enormously broad, kind of multiple discipline area and at least have a frame of reference for what we're working in. And then we're going to transition into the questions that we're going to ask the panel members. We'll go through this Q&A with the panel, and then we'll invite the audience to ask questions. So let's get started. Oh, first, what are we about here? So our charge was to talk about the potential of Gen AI to advance ecological research in various areas like modeling and monitoring. These are all relevant. We do have some experience in these areas, but we also, again, have more questions and more needs to be able to address a whole suite of really critical issues in ecology. We'll highlight the distinctive strengths of Gen AI. And again, this will probably be more in the context of here are a set of needs that we have, and we're interested in what Gen AI may have to provide. We have some ideas about that, but we have a lot to learn. And then key limitations as well. And those span just a broad set of topics from not just algorithms, but the data that we have and we collect, and what are the practices and the cultures within our community, and what does that mean for ecology to interface with other experts in AI like yourselves. So a little bit about me. I'm from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm an ecosystems ecologist, and about 8 years ago, I was told there was a computer scientist at the University of Minnesota who could help us take on some deep learning issues that we were inspired but knew nothing about. And I wrote a 2-page email to Vipin, and he actually responded. And we brought a team up here and started working in the KGML realm ever since. And so I've had a number of funded projects over the years and a bunch of papers, and currently working with Anuj Karpatni in macrosystems biology and knowledge-guided machine learning, and also with CUAHSI, another former student of Vipin's who's not here. I worked for years in GLEON, the Global Lake Ecological Observatory Network. This is a grassroots network of ecologists from around the world who study lakes and reservoirs. It is, I think, arguably the most successful international ecological and, to a certain extent, maybe natural sciences network in existence. It's been around for about 20 years. I bring it up today for a couple of reasons. One is it is a community in which new ideas like this can be grown. It also is a framework in which we've focused on developing international and interdisciplinary collaborations. And success in Gen AI is going to depend on our ability to collaborate effectively. And then also data issues as well. Currently, I run the Environmental Data Institute. It is an NSF-funded repository for the environmental sciences. It's been in existence for a decade. We take in published data and focus on reusing data. So this is a topic, because it applies to a number of us, that's going to come up quite a lot during our panel discussion. Here's just a little bit on science. On the left side, we had a group of graduate students within GLEON that we were training in interdisciplinary research to look at a data set Vipin's group created called RealSat. It's changing lake areas at the global scale. And we were interested in finding out what's changing in the US and where is it changing. And those blue dots really kind of highlight different areas and the nature of change. But what I want to really point out here is we're sort of classifying ecological change at a broad spatial scale. Where we really want to go with this is how do ecosystems function? So we don't want to just describe patterns. We want to get down into function. And that's sort of the right-hand side of this slide, which is dynamical systems modeling at scale. And what's intrigued me for a long time is a trained ecologist just needs to know, 6 or 8 things about an ecosystem before we can make some kind of reasonable prediction. But we've been really challenged to try to replicate that quantitatively in modeling space, just because humans are so capable in a certain sense and so flexible in how they deal with things. Now, in a project where we're developing foundation model for lakes, we have the opportunity to kind of take that question on and see what does it take for foundation model to make that kind of prediction. So that's about me. And now, Jordan, over to you.
You, Paul, and it's great to be here. So my name's Jordan Reed. I am the head of CUAHSI, which is a consortium, a nonprofit consortium that's actually been around for almost 25 years, started in 2001. And it's meant to work across the many universities that have an interest in water. And it provides a core domain data repository, which is called HydroShare, and also provides access to training and new methods that are relevant to hydrology, especially in training next generation professionals, focusing a lot on graduate students. So that's what I'm doing now. And I've been in this position since January of 2023. Prior to that, I spent a bit over a decade at the U.S. Geological Survey, so a federal science agency, where I founded the data science branch, which has grown to about 20 federal employees, and is also the place where I was when I first was connected to this group through Paul, and did some early work in this KGML space in water prediction. So the figure that we've got up here is from a paper that we wrote back in 2019. Ben, Anuj, Michael, Paul, and others are on that paper. This brought, I would say, some of these concepts to the water discipline, being published in one of our high-tier journals in water resources, and kind of tested this idea of can these new modeling approaches that effectively hybridize what the strongest data-driven models are versus what the strongest or kind of foundational process-based models, what those bring to the table, how they deal with data richness and data sparsity. Can we get the best of both worlds with these approaches? There's, of course, a lot behind this work. There's a lot that came after it to take KGML much further, but with this work, we were able to explain or to show the value here, and to also get at some of the obvious shortcomings that a lot of domain scientists had with up and coming AI approaches, such as out of bounds prediction. How can a model that's trained in the summer function in the winter? And showing that by including these process-based approaches, we could, like I said before, get the best out of both worlds. So presently sitting at my spot with CUAHSI, I'm really interested in representing the domain data assets and how those can be better leveraged with these new initiatives, and how we can bring water problems to the table as key questions to ask in test beds. And I think that's a challenge, because water is something that is fractured across 26 different federal agencies, all have water in their mission statement. So we've got a challenge of lots of different places where water data live, ecological data as well, and the challenge of being able to put data sets together that truly get the most and best available data and information for that type of prediction. So lots of challenges related to that, both on the data building and access and side of things, and also on what questions are asked and what advances would be useful for aquatic ecology and hydrology.
Great. Chris.
Florian from the National Ecological Observatory Network. So we are a large ecological data provider. Other than that, my research interests are, I primarily work on the surface atmosphere exchange group. So we look at fluxes of carbon, heat, and water from the surface of the atmosphere. We do that at multiple sites across the continent. Other than that, for my PhD work, I worked in paleolimnology, so a little bit of a different field, but a lot of the same concepts there. I'm also interested in how we can extract ecological data from images, and I think that's how I got involved with this group primarily. And finally, I'm very interested in how we can improve network operations and data quality through the use of AI. How can we make operations more efficient, but also how can we make sure that our data products are feeding this community and easily used. And so on the bottom right of the slide up there is just an example of what a NEON site looks like, just so that you all have reference. This is one of our terrestrial sites. We have a tower that's measuring atmospheric parameters, and we link that with precipitation measurements and soil measurements so that we get a comprehensive view of how the ecosystem is responding. Not shown here are all the discrete samples that we take at the same time, but I primarily work on the instrument side.
Great.
Next slide. So just to give you an overview of all the data that NEON provides. So just for some quick overview, NEON is a large facility funded by the National Science Foundation. It's a continental scale observatory, and it's designed to enable understanding and forecasting of environmental changes and understanding ecology. So some various data types that we collect are from the atmosphere, such as the fluxes I just mentioned. We also look at organisms, populations, and communities, the more typical biodiversity sort of things in ecology. We also look at ecohydrology. So we also have aquatic sites in addition to the terrestrial site that I showed earlier. We look at biogeochemistry, which is essentially how all these things come together, how the biology interfaces with the chemistry and geology. And then we also look at land-based process, land use process with remote sensing data. So I think that one thing that I would really like to see going forward is how can this large standardized data set be leveraged by the AI community? And also how can we learn from that community to improve the data that we're providing?
Great.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mike SanClements, and I work at NEON and Battelle as well. I work closely with Chris. I currently lead research initiatives for our research infrastructure business line in Battelle. So that includes the NEON program as well as the Arctic logistics for NSF and some other projects. I've been interested for a long time in basically biogeochemical processes that are at scale. So things like the effects of atmospheric deposition on phosphorus cycling, soil carbon, precipitation, and climate effects. As I've worked on these processes at scale and worked on large research infrastructures networks, it's really easy to see the benefit of artificial intelligence, the way we can use these new tools to learn new things from these large data sets. And so a couple of things I've really been interested in lately are two things. One is I have an NSF ExcelNet Award right now, and the goal of that award is to harmonize global data related to ecological drought from the Jerry Network, which is a global ecosystem research infrastructures, and I chaired that group over the last couple of years, and that's 5 research networks. So that ICOS and ELTER in Europe, NEON in the US, SCION in South Africa, CERN in China, and TERN in Australia. So we've been working to pull together all these data sets, some basic ones, just some preliminary ones actually. And I'm really interested in the way that we can use artificial intelligence to make new inferences with these large data sets, but also in how we might use artificial intelligence and LLMs to get our data to a place where it's very easy for those systems to build the ontologies and map these products and harmonize them for us, because it's a slog to do it manually. Currently, I'm just about to start a new award from the NSF Colorado Wyoming engine, the Ascend engine. We're partnered with NVIDIA and NREL to start to pull in some of these Neon data products and look at being able to create a digital twin where you can tweak precipitation and get at some of how that might drive other ecological processes. So the other part of this that I find really interesting, and Chris mentioned this too, is not just the research side, but Chris touched on this. How do you make these large research infrastructures more efficient and get more research done for each dollar and make them safer and make them more, impactful? And so we've been working a lot on that internally. A couple of things we've been doing is trying to create just some simple things like create a library of all of our thousands and thousands of pages of documentation for all of our sensors and maintenance plans and field protocols for collecting samples and safety documentation, and creating a RAG-based system where our field techs and hundreds of scientists can go into that and query it for questions and get answers really quickly rather than spending 20 minutes every time. And what we've also realized that's interesting for something like field operations is there's inherent danger in being out in the field. We all know it if we're field scientists, especially in remote places. And so we realized that you could sort of use these systems to front load answers to be about safety first and remind people of critical things, or if there's problems in the way sensors are being deployed, like a hiccup with one sensor, you can teach the system to front load that information. So I'm interested from both that research perspective and this operational perspective and how we can use these tools to advance science.
Okay, good. We are on. Thank you. My name is McEachran. I'm a research hydrologist here at the University of Minnesota. I've worn many hats over my educational and professional careers, a few of which I've included on this slide. From my undergraduate days studying physics, I developed a mindset focused on reducing everything to a sort of Cartesian machine, right? I went on to graduate studies focused specifically on forest hydrology. Then was an operational flood forecaster, scheduling people's overnight shifts to forecast record flooding, and then a flood model developer at the National Weather Service. Now I continue to develop flood models, including those utilizing Gen AI. But my focus on mechanism and process understanding is really never far away, and I like to think there's some manner of continuity within my career. Given our panel's focus on ecology, and Paul, you mentioned practices and cultures of the field, I'm sort of excited to draw on my experience to just have a few opening remarks. I don't know, in a somewhat more narrative fashion about being a recovering reductionist. So the study of the water balance, which ties together my overarching work as a catchment scientist, has had sort of two primary camps since its modern formalization, which I've seen conveniently organized into the foresters and the engineers, represented by these two pictures. That's Aldo Leopold, who was not a hydrologist, but it just, we can't have an ecology panel without him. And then that's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers building Lock and Dam number 2, I believe. They had to haul in a ton of sand because they couldn't drive the pilings into the limestone bedrock as well as they maybe wanted to. So I'll include a disclaimer right now to state that I believe that these two sort of outlooks or dispositions in tension is good for the development of my field, and one needs to recognize that both sides, if you will, have made key contributions and to both the field and to the public good. However, having spent a lot of time trying to understand how forest communities specifically influence stream flow through one of the crown jewels of American forest hydrology, I know it's a fairly narrow category, but grant me my crown jewels, via the U.S. National Forest Service Paired Catchment Network, I tend to lean forester by disposition, as I imagine many ecologists do. So what are these two camps and what do they tend to hold? The forester camp I'll define as tending to place first precedence on the whole rather than the part, as controlling the observed cycling of water, or at least searching there for explanation. So pointing to the broader landscape community, forests, soils, biotic communities, etc. Problems will be solved trying to understand how these communities interact with the water budget. For example, the forester will look at a region that has been deforested with compacted soils and attribute increasing floods to these landscape changes. However, what has been termed the engineers' camp tend to reduce elements to their constituent parts, placing the first precedence of explanation to these parts. An engineer could look at flooding and be hesitant to attribute the flood to what's going on in the landscape to any large degree, and will probably want to build a dam to control the flow, alter waterways to impact conveyance, etc. So, you know, still recovering from the French Revolution, as I imagine most people are. Right afterwards, there was a large-scale deforestation as sort of crown lands were sold off, right? And then they had some really wicked flooding. And so this really spurred on this debate in forest hydrology, right? Is it the deforestation that's causing the floods? Is it something else? So in 1858, a scientist by the name Champion wrote, after this large-scale deforestation, he was reacting to the opinion that flooding is new in France and deforestation is its cause by answering, at all times, our country has suffered no less terrifying floods, relatively speaking, than those that we have witnessed. And the regions which, under our very eyes, have been devastated by the waters have never been spared this misfortune. Effectively saying, we've always had flooding. We're always going to have flooding. Sort of show me the receipts. Show me the evidence that this deforestation, this soil compaction is causing this what seems like an increase in floods. Compare this to our maybe forester camp, Aldo Leopold, who said 80 years later in 1938, take Weaver's discovery that the composition of the plant community determines the ability of soils to retain their granulation and hence their stability. If finally verified, it was, this new principle may necessitate the revision of our entire system of thought on flood control and erosion control. Well, what's happening for flood control at around the same time Leopold says this? That picture right there, actually slightly before 1938, the lock and dam system. So why do I bring this up here? Because every hydrologist who develops a model has to choose a sort of mixture of these dispositions with which to approach the problem of how to best represent reality. Because the effects of forests on floods, for example, is still quite an unsettled problem in hydrology. There are even recent papers going back and forth that are sort of these two camps. No, forests don't really impact large floods. They would always happen the same anyway. No, of course forests impact floods. It's I can point you to some really fun back and forth in the literature, right? But I also bring this up because I think the difficult questions in the discipline can be clarified in some of this tension here between the whole and between the part. When classical statistics arrived on the scene and allowed us to conduct robust experimentation on the landscape, this did offer some clarity on some aspects of this debate. For example, a whole network of experimental watersheds now exists throughout the United States where you have long-term reference catchments and then experimental catchments where you can do treatments like cut down trees and observe the effects within a sort of before-after control impact study, right? That's a certain paradigm, and that whole network throughout the landscape is inspired specifically by a statistical concept. Right. So I think it's entirely possible that we're at a similar juncture with the rapid emergence of Gen AI. And what I especially like about the Gen AI work that I do is it recognizes the inherent limitations in what we have historically called physically based models or physics-based models, but are at most times, fundamentally the fruit of a reductionist paradigm. I now believe that what we observe is fundamental. Sort of previous brain me went through a phase where observations were always tainted with noise, and the most real thing is the governing equation, derived from first principles, etc. Now I think we're at a point where a rapidly emerging discipline within Gen AI takes our observation and experience as fundamental and goes from there. And it seems to me that our approach to use Gen AI for science also will spring partly from this tension between wholes and parts, which has been going on, again, at least since post-French Revolution. Which equations should we emphasize and which do we de-emphasize as a limitation within the AI framework? How could we build an AI-based architecture that seems to emphasize the most important things in the system, whether they be wholes or parts, and how ought they to interact? It's been a very exciting field to start to contribute to, and I've made some excellent colleagues along the way, and I'm just excited to be able to sort of ask these questions that probably will not have solid answers within the next 100 years. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Zach. And thanks for all the introductions. Zach, I like you'd really focused on this notion of conceptual models. and how they can really differ. And often our great advances happen when we update our conceptual models. Ecology is a huge area. We thought we'd put one up here, a conceptual model, just as a framework for us to have in mind as we address some of the aspects of the question. So what the world beyond us basics research scientists really care about are those services that are at the top that ecosystems provide, everything from food and water to biodiversity, energy, a whole suite of services. We tend to work individually in different ecosystems and different parts of the biome. And so I'm a lake person. I work in the lake, and we have forestry and hydrology and others here as well. And underlying that, of course, are just the basic principles of physics, chemistry, and biology. And so when we attack problems that are relevant, we think at least to ecosystem services. And if I take an example of water quality, we could do that in a lake. We often look at the properties of the system, try to figure out what the states are in the system and connect those with boxes and arrow diagrams and a set of differential equations, which might describe the time dynamics of the system, put it all in some context that we assume is fairly constant, and then hit it with a bunch of drivers and look to see what the outcome is. It works pretty well. The problem is it takes a year for a graduate student to study one system, just to get a model up and running and calibrated for one system. It doesn't scale. It often doesn't scale through time either. If you calibrate the model for one particular ecosystem at a particular time, it often doesn't work at a different time. And so we're confronted with this problem of generalizability, of scalability and effort, and a myriad of issues. And, it's time to rethink not only the methodology, but perhaps even the conceptual model that we use to attack these kind of problems. So what we're going to do now is we're going to transition into the question and answer part. And I'm going to just join the panel up here, and I'll pose the questions for the group, and we're going to take volunteers to answer them. And these are the questions. So I can read the first one off, then I'll have a seat so you guys don't have to turn around. So this one came up over lunch, really. And so we inserted it as the first question. It's right at the top of our minds. What are the issues surrounding domain data so that it can be most effectively used in AI while servicing the needs of the domain that provides the data?
The first one on this. So domain data and getting it to the point where it can be leveraged by the type of work that we're talking about in these 2 days. In ecology, I would say one of the big issues is we've got fragmentation of where the data live. We have lots of different specific repositories that may be funded by certain short-lived projects. And they're kind of remnants of snapshots of work and observations and field experimentation or sampling campaigns that are built from one perspective and are hard to translate and compare with others. We also have issues related to discoverability, which are tied to that kind of fractured nature of where the data lives. So you kind of have to be an expert in just simply knowing the diversity of different programs that funded data repositories or existing observation campaigns to be able to assemble things together. And then I think we'll get into this more in later questions, so I won't go more than a superficial level, but just the diversity in data types that we have make harmonization and comparability a major challenge, especially with the way that ecologists have been traditionally trained with data and modeling, where it's a data intensive field from the perspective of the use of statistics as a primary backbone of the discipline, but not necessarily built and trained to scale approaches and to use and leverage data outside of one's own campaign.
I could just jump in for a second and echo something you said about a number of different data types. And it goes beyond that. In that ExcelNet project, one of the things it became immediately evident is we're talking about soil data. Okay, soil moisture. Well, what depth did you measure it at? What depth did you measure it at? How many depths? Same with soil texture, same with soil carbon, right? Same with soil temperature. And so then it's digging back down into metadata and how, if they are different, okay, who has to make the decisions to align these things? And how do you disseminate that information and the information about those methods and protocols you use to make those choices, both into whatever statistics you're doing or into a model, but ultimately to the user. So it becomes almost a doubly complicated problem very quickly. Yeah, and so that's why I feel like it makes the standardization is just so evident, and it's just showed the power of Neon where we do have everything standardized, but then it becomes harder to bring in additional. So thinking about ways to overcome those and hedge that uncertainty, those differences.
Thanks, Mike. I'll also add that this concept of data being AI ready and us as domain scientists and network operators, what does that really mean? How can we enable users to interface with these data? How do we ensure that our data are being incorporated into models that people are developing? I think is really key. But I think there's a lot of different explanations for what is AI ready in data. And I think that's a conversation we should all have and should define a bit better in terms of ecology.
Yeah, I'll just pile on a little bit. And I think this is one of the biggest sort of issues or maybe opportunities with ecological data is it can be extremely messy. And oftentimes it's collected with a certain mechanism in mind that like produce the data. That's sometimes hard to get at. I was just wanting to model a lake level actually. And okay, great. I've got, oh, wow, they took measurements every so-and-so. Like, this is great, really high resolution data. Well, turns out then just Google, thanks. We find a report from like 15 years ago buried on a PDF somewhere that's like, oh, yeah, by the way, when the creek downstream gets high, it overtops the dam and sends a bunch of water back into the lake, right? Oh, my gosh. And there's no sensor on the stream. So it's a situation where the mechanism that is the sort of hydrological mechanism that's like giving you that lake level is kind of two-phase in a way, right? It's both what's coming in from upstream to create the lake level, but it's also sometimes when water is high, so sort of correlated with the lake level itself, it's sometimes caused by what's downstream. And usually we're not very good at modeling effects going from downstream back upstream, right? It's like upstream to downstream is the causation we're used to thinking about. So it's sort of like almost almost meta scientific step of putting data in context of other data like water surface elevation versus water flow that don't have an easy relationship all the time, but also the context with like what mechanisms might have gone into generating the data in the first place, not even starting to mention how we might model that.
Yeah, and I'll just add a few things to that from the perspective of EDI, the Environmental Data Institute. So we have about 100,000 data packages. Each data package could have tens to even millions of data points in it. So there are literally billions and billions of data that are out there about environmental observations. And those data are well annotated and so theoretically can be put to use. But as been pointed out here, there's a lot of interpretation that has to happen. There's also a lot of data munging. And there's a pretty good rule of thumb, which is if you have a project that requires analysis of big data sets and you're getting the data set together, 80% of your time is going to be spent munging the data. And so we have an opportunity for repositories to play a role here, which is to help streamline what Neon is already doing, is sort of end-to-end data collection to presenting data for consumption on the other end too. And this will be a cultural change for ecology, but I think this kind of cultural change can be driven by opportunities, for example, in AI. And this extends, I believe, to the testbed world as well, where when we have guidance for the magnitude and the type of data and the formatting of those data, we can rally as a way of participating in Gen AI. We can rally to help provide and interpret those data and make them useful for AI. The problem in a lot of cases up till now is that repositories have been viewed as a place where data go to die. In other words, you publish your data, you stick them there, and that's the end of it. But that's changing really rapidly as people are taking advantage of living usable data sets. And so we need that positive feedback to keep things going. There's a cultural element to this too, which at least from the ecologist side is critical, which is data. We consider data often to be a primary object in science. And so we publish data sets. Some of our inherent value goes along with the data. And so when those data get reused, at the very least, it's important to get credit for using those data. But ideally, the use of those data is a mechanism by which collaboration occurs as well. And so again, data repositories have a role to play by connecting those who generate data with those who need the data on the other side, and trying to understand what the potential collaborations could be in that realm. I think we've flogged the data thing. The first question pretty good? Okay, all right. Let's go on to the second question. What are the advantages and limitations of using AI models for emulating environmental processes compared to using AI for parameter estimation, for example? Do we have a taker? Oh.
I guess I'll start by saying one of the really interesting things about using Gen AI approaches is that we don't have to understand all the processes to get to the model. And I think that is, I think in some circles, maybe that's viewed as a limitation, but I actually think that's a huge benefit because we don't have to get hung up with every equation that leads to explaining the system, right? We can learn how the system behaves and then go back and figure out what those processes are. So that's one area where I think is really exciting here.
Yeah, I think it seems to me like some of it's about sort of, again, I don't know, disposition and purpose from the start. And I feel like each approach, I don't know, I think there was on one of the slides earlier today, there was a slider between sort of process centric KGML and and more, I don't know, deep learning centric KGML. And I think that those kind of, these two approaches, the emulation versus the parameter estimation kind of represent different ends of that spectrum. So I think really like sort of identifying the problem from the outset and being able to like formalize your approach in one of these like kind of taxonomy systems that we saw this morning. I think that's why the work by the sort of broader ML community and science and ML community is really important in being able to sort of define your approach from the outset. Yeah.
Can I say that I agree with both of those notions, and I really think that idea of using these tools as an exploratory means to sort of pick out new processes or new patterns that we couldn't see before because there is so much data, and then go further investigate them and potentially bring them back into process-based models. Exciting.
So having the privilege of working with computer scientists who really kind of look at a system problem sometimes differently than we do, it's fun to just kind of learn different ways of viewing things and learn vocabulary that we never would have used before, like catastrophic forgetting. I mean, it's one of my favorite terms, and we've never used it in ecology, but we're gonna. And this is a little bit off of the actual question, but I think about in ecology, the kinds of equations we use to govern a system often aren't completely sort of anchored in theoretical physics, or not always, mass conservative, for example. There's a lot of flexibility, softness around those equations and how the system is wired. What state variables are connected to each other and how can often be interpreted pretty differently depending upon the scale at which you're modeling the system, what you're emphasizing, what your questions are. And one of the things I've learned in these collaborations is that when you embed those ideas in an AI framework, you have the opportunity to test the actual model itself or our assumptions about the model. And you might get back answers and information from the AI approach that causes you to rethink how you wire the system and what you emphasize in the system. And ideally discover new processes that you didn't realize were important in that particular scale too. Okay, on to question number 3. What are some of the unique capabilities of Gen AI models that differentiate them from traditional process-based models? And what could be the impact of these differences on ecological science?
The thing that sprang to my mind first was the ability to sort of integrate or assimilate real-time observations. I think, whereas generally we're doing some sort of like optimization or Kalman filtering or something to like get observations in real time and change the states and rerun. Like that's awfully expensive, especially at large scales. And I think sort of the idea that there can be an upfront investment in a way in the sort of training and development of the model, and then in real time being able to sort of run in that like more inference based space for taking in new information. I think that's really powerful, and it's going to open up a lot of doors for the development of more real-time forecasting systems for ecological problems.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, and to just add that the ability to fine tune to specific systems rapidly and very specific decisions is something that is very hard to do with a traditional process-based model. So the idea of adding potentially new parameters, coding those into a process-based model, that's months, modifying a training regime or changing your loss function to focus on a particular threshold for a decision, that's kind of minutes of coding work. So that potential to be more societally and decision relevant rapidly and translate into different decisions and environments rapidly is a huge advantage.
I'd just add too that maintaining a large sensor network is expensive, costly. Neon has 27,000 sensor streams basically running all the time from Alaska to Puerto Rico. And you can imagine the maintenance and the QA/QC that's involved in that. And so deploying some of these tools, perhaps at the edge even, because we have computing power in our instrument huts, to not only effectively look at QA/QC maybe in real time and look for anomalies or trigger additional things, but also to try to get towards predictive sensor maintenance or predictive sensor failure. So you don't have to be on a schedule to send people out every 2 weeks, but there's some sort of forewarning, and you can make things cheaper and more effective, ultimately increasing data quality and the quality of your data set. I think there's probably a lot of powerful approaches there that I see. I know Chris and I spend a lot of time talking about those lately.
I think that's going to be a big advance in network maintenance in the near future. But to get back to the original question, I think one of the big benefits, and it's been said before, is efficiency, and that we don't need to, ecology is complicated, right? We're probably never going to understand all the underlying processes. So to have some mechanism to let the data speak for themselves and let the system speak for itself is I think, going to be a huge benefit with this approach.
And I think at a fairly fundamental level, it's going to cause us to rethink how we think about the data. So what is the feature in data? How does a model work? Do we label everything, or is it self-supervised from the parents? These are concepts, again, that are pretty new to ecologists, and are going to require that we not only understand the methodology of it, but we kind of do the mental gymnastics to rethink the data itself. Okay, the next question: what, in your opinion, is the biggest hurdle in using current Gen AI methodologies to enable scientific revolution in ecology?
I could start with an interesting. I think it's all I say. Turn it over to the others, but one interesting thing we recently learned in our ExcelNet project was we did a global survey of researchers from previous to 7 years PhD, so 0 to 7, and then post. And we had 587 responses globally to this survey. And in the survey, there was a number of questions, but there is one part that had 16 different skills. And the question was something along the lines of rank these, based on the order of importance to your career now and going forward. And artificial intelligence was last, and last in amount of training received and last in perceived importance, almost unanimously, which I thought was fascinating globally. So I don't know, maybe some sort of, there's a hurdle there,
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about some of the trust barriers maybe with the methods across fields. I think that's a big challenge. I also think linking data across scales is a challenge. So, and I think Anush, your group has been working on this a little bit lately, I learned. For example, a project that has continuous data, maybe think about temperature data, and then linking that with a sample that you go out and collect annually, and then a different sample that you collect every 5 years. Do you aggregate those high frequency data do you take averages? How do you get all those data together? And then how do you feed it into the model? I think that in ecology in particular, we're dealing with data over large spatial and temporal scale differences. So how to get all those data into the model and leverage them so that you can retain all the information and you're not just kind of averaging it away is a big challenge.
Barriers. I mean, I think we've already talked about data, right? Like data is a barrier. But I guess I don't know if this is the right place to mention it, but like the ecologists that I know, like, or I'll put it this way, the best true like statisticians that I know are ecologists. Like I learned statistics from an ecologist. Like that like way of looking at science and at experiment and at the world, I think is very like it's a very strong part of the discipline, at least in my sort of experience of it. Even in hydrology, like extreme value analysis, like flooding was a very early sort of application, like Emil Gumbel, and now stream flow isn't independent, identically distributed, but we won't go there. But effectively, like I think that, and then as I sort of learned more and more of the actual sort of nuts and bolts of the like machine learning methods, let's say, I often found myself going, oh, what you're explaining to me is just insert statistics concept here. But there's kind of I found a different terminology and like culture around these concepts within like sort of classical statistics as it's taught in I don't know if the word would be like Fisherian, like, like Ronald Fisher, plot scale, Rothamsted, agricultural plots sort of statistics versus the more recent advances in ML. So I think like partly like being able to translate and sort of develop that mutual understanding and tapping into sort of that mutual understanding of the field of statistics, but maybe one that has been really imbued within the discipline of ecology. And it's partly because of the data issue in having to deal with sparse data or only getting one field season to collect your data. Like your experimental design needs to be really solid. You can't sample one, 6,000 times per second, like some of the like little pendulum system, like it's kind of a different world in that way. So I think that is worth remarking on. I don't know if it's a hurdle, but it is kind of an interesting facet of the discipline, I think, and how it interfaces with the Gen AI community.
I would just add that I think we're overcoming one other big hurdle just by being here today, and that is all of us have ideas about our data and things we'd like to analyze and things we'd like to do, but we maybe don't know who to reach out to, who has the expertise to employ some of these methods. So bringing us all together, I think, is a great step in the right direction to overcoming what might be the biggest hurdle of all.
Fantastic. Let's jump to the last question. Let's try to keep it to 3 minutes, so we have a few minutes at least in case there are any questions from the audience. This is opportunities in using in situ sensor networks and remotely sensed data and scientific simulations for models of the environment. So, Jordan?
I see this as a very intriguing, collaborative set of questions that could come out of spanning domain ways of observing and knowing versus a Gen AI approach to it. So to me, this example hits really close to home. It's similar to a comment that was just made earlier about, okay, so we've got satellite data, which gives us many, many pixels, many, many different values, maybe one snapshot in time. Then we've got time series sensors, high frequency, and then we've got a grab sample that's high value. It costs a lot of money to take. And our traditional way of analyzing is to put all that through a filter where we just end up with comparable values. But the way where we can use that spatial information, use that temporal information, and then use that data quality or richness from that sample all together in modeling approaches that leverage that diversity, and building approaches that can truly leverage it is really exciting, and can help us squeeze a lot more information out of data that has been collected over the last 50 years or so, that has mostly been left on the cutting room floor for most science that simplifies and filters that out.
Perfect. Are there any questions from the audience?
Good afternoon. Thank you. You mentioned, I think you mentioned about the hurdle that AI doesn't appear in the ecology. So how advanced is ecological informatics, similar to bioinformatics or any genomics or something like that? If that is the case, I assume ecological study is very data-rich environment. Then why is that those two are not well developed so far?
I'll take first crack at it. It's an excellent question. And it reminds me of the slide that Anu showed of all the different methods that have fed into Gen AI, from time series analysis, autocorrelation, Bayes nets. We do all those things and we teach all those things, but for some reason, and I think it's more a disciplinary thing than really an intellectual issue. For some reason, people have just been reluctant or unable or haven't had the opportunity to make the translation from essentially that slide, those techniques, into something that integrates those techniques in new ways that are powerful. So we need exposure, we need education, we need real life experience in the educational environment. Other thoughts from the group?
Are there any undergraduate or graduate level courses specifically like ecological informatics or something like that?
I think the short answer is yes. And there was somebody behind with his hand up for quite a while too. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I think the short answer is yes, but it's highly variable. We're always looking for a course where you can learn how to model an ecosystem. They're extremely rare, and I'm not sure why. I think it's because most students come from a natural history background as opposed to an engineering, mathematical, kind of background. That's a pretty big dividing line.
In the intro slide, you show a pyramid of going from science essentially to the public in terms of, using ecology for recreation, for example. Do you see Gen AI play a role in explaining to the public why that decision was made, where it's coming from, and kind of try to explain the science behind it to your stakeholders, essentially?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I could see that could be pretty powerful. I think I've messed around with a little bit of, of just using Gen AI to sort of take something very complex and put it in plain language just to see how well it does. And it does do a good job. So I could see instances where it could be good. And I also see how it could be useful in I think someone touched on this morning, communications between fields that are trying to work together that have different lingos and vocabularies. So I think there is a lot of power there. And maybe highlighting important things and distilling that information in a way that's powerful and very easy to digest. So that's how I have to take my first thought.
And let me just add real briefly, I think we absolutely have to do that. I think we don't have a choice. We've been talking, at least within our discipline for a while, that the appetite of the public and administrations for basic science is getting lower and lower and lower. That doesn't mean it's not important, but we have to make our science more relevant and connected to the community. And we've just been hit on the side of the head in the last 6 months with that message. It's going to have to happen, or we're going to be out of business.
So I was thinking about weather forecasting as something that starts with many of the kinds of data sources that many of you were talking about, but the nature of the problem is very different. And the basic difference that, from my viewpoint, is that's a relatively homogeneous problem, whereas here you've got data heterogeneity. And heterogeneity, irrespective of whether you're using GenAI or any other method, just makes life hard. And so this is a much harder problem, right? However, to the extent that GenAI is better able to handle heterogeneity than other forms of AI, it would seem to me that if we've had success in the use of GenAI for weather forecasting, that it is all the more called for in the context of the problems that you're posing here. Okay. I just wasn't sure my logic was right. I see everybody nodding. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. And maybe this is more a question for perhaps my models and methods colleagues than the folks in ecology. But I would say the hard problems are easy problems. The easy problems is something floods every year. I could draw a line and say that's the floodplain and something like that. The hard problems are things that might happen, you know, your once in 1,000-year flood. You know, there's a front that comes from the southeast, something else comes from the southwest, and make sure that the front doesn't proceed and dumps it all on top of Asheville, North Carolina. Doesn't happen in 1,000 years. You'll probably never get data for that anyway. And so that's the rare events. The next thing is the ill-conditioned events. You know, these are your butterfly effects, and small things happening somewhere will end up going somewhere entirely different. And the third thing is what I would say highly statistically significant but extremely weakly correlated events. So you see loss of your river deltas, but that's correlated with something way upstream. There's a beaver in Minnesota that's not munching its bamboo is strong enough. So as best as I understand the methods that exist right now, none of them really handle any of these very well. We have no data for 1,000-year events. We have very little ability to handle very ill-conditioned processes. And we have almost no way of finding extremely weakly correlated but highly statistically significant events. To me, that's sort of the interesting space of problems. I don't know how we solve these. I don't know if you have thoughts on these.
You've identified some absolutely terrific areas around which we should write grant proposals. And one of our challenges, let me just take one of those examples, which is the weak correlations, which are actually very important. And so if you look in any one ecosystem, any one lake, you might not be able to detect that event. But if you have 1,000 or 1,000,000 systems, it's embedded in there as a very weak signal. And our traditional approaches aren't very good at pulling out that kind of information and making use of it. But Gen AI is a great opportunity to detect that particular problem. The others are great examples too.
As you're shuffling the microphone, I'll just add, I think those two last questions/comments are related in that, you used a lot of flood examples. And I think, yeah, the atmosphere is a continuum, but the very interesting things about the land surface is the sort of singularities, right? It's where two soil zones meet. It's where the bedrock makes an outcrop and connects the groundwater and the surface water. It's all these sort of nonlinearities that make it particularly challenged to model, but also give rise to these behaviors that you highlighted in your kind of 3 points. So I think, just to make a plug, the sort of hydrology, land surface, what happens when the raindrop hits the ground. It's pretty interesting stuff.
So one of the questions for the panel might be to bring together your panel with what went on this morning is, how do you design an ideal test bed that would satisfy the first level of phase one of what Gen AI would be looking to do? And, you know, you could go back to sort of instrument sampling. What's the process for multi-process instrument sampling to capture the characteristics based on, or time scale of those processes? And then what scientists have done for a long time is trade space for time and say, how do you sample the surrounding environment, and how does that bear on the design in space? I mean, the design of the test. So,
I'll also, I think that's a great point, and I'll add that I think we can use that sort of thinking to identify gaps in existing networks and where we might need to augment or adjust as we move forward to better create those test beds.
One of your earlier slides, maybe the very opening slide, you mentioned. Yeah, when you, on your opening slide, you mentioned that ecologists can ask for 5 or 6 properties, and then they can tell a lot about a lake, right? So the question is, how far are we from doing this using process models or the traditional machine learning models, and potentially how Gen AI could help? And again, these are questions, you know, the question is, what parts of it can be answered? What parts need to be thought through as we go forward?
Yeah, we can't do it with a process model with 6 or 8 things. Maybe that's not strictly true, you know, but if you want to go to a new system where you know nothing about it, and you get to ask 6 or 8 questions, somebody who's trained can ask those questions and make a reasonable prediction. And of course, it's because they've been exposed to hundreds or thousands of similar systems and situations, and they have an educational background. It's another way of saying, you know, the human is sort of a Gen AI in a way, right? And so it'll be exciting to see what it takes to get actual Gen AI kind of up to that level. But it feels like it's almost in grasp.
Because that's what generation system was supposed to do. Just like humans read up a lot, that it reads up a lot, or knows quite a bit. Yeah. So those are the kind of questions that I think it came up in the previous presentation. And just before lunch, the test beds, the evaluations and such. And our question is, through these discussions about panels, about topics, the discipline can identify some of these things. So I was at the KVD conference, the Big Data Mining Conference at Toronto last week, and there were 2 major keynotes, all on LLMs, and they all kept reminding us that this is at the underlying. Oh, and thanks. So I was at the meeting last week, and there were 2 keynotes on LLM, and they both kept reminding that, look, at the underlying technology of these is just next token prediction, and they're still doing such an amazing job. Now, the counterpart of that is we all use computers. And 70 years ago, when these computers were designed, the 191 architecture, it simply says load, increment, decrement, and store. These are the 4 instructions. And if you have it, you can program anything, right? So the question is, how do you go from the next token prediction to solving your problem? I guess it's the same problem that computer scientists have been solving for 70 years. How do you go from the simplest abstraction of a computer and solve the problem that bring us to this meeting? And then, of course, we did that. And again, a topic came up before lunch, was you do divide and conquer. I think several of you mentioned that. So what is the counterpart of divide and conquer? What is the concept of modularity, so that we don't end up being a Gen AI black box that solves the problem and you still don't know why it solves it, and then you worry whether it's going to solve it sometime in the wrong way without telling me that it has no information. So that anything to comment on that would be.
Well, just a quick comment, and the short answer is I don't have a good answer. But we do have a project that's called Modular Compositional Learning, and it's embedding process equations as modules within an AI framework in which the AI has the opportunity to test modules and replace them with alternatives, AI alternatives. And then in that way, it can give you feedback as to what works well and what doesn't. It's conceptually relatively simple, but it does break apart the problem into a few pieces that we can consume and test and understand and play with a little bit. But much more work to be done.